CEO asked her daughter to pick a new father from 5 rich men, but she chose the single dad janitor. "Mom, when do I get a dad I actually like?" The small voice of Chloe echoed through the chandelier-lit ballroom, filling the space as if it belonged to the event itself. The room, momentarily still from the paddle rays, froze. Glasses hung mid-air, waiting to find their place again. Madison Hale, standing on stage, didn't flinch, but the question struck her deep, where her armor ended. The gala had just turned quiet, everyone lost in their own worlds, but Chloe's innocent query pierced through it all. Some guests awkwardly chuckled, unsure how to react. Others, too uncomfortable, pretended to check their phones or whispered amongst themselves. A man in a tux at table 7 leaned toward his date. "This is why founders shouldn't bring their kids," he muttered, oblivious to the cameras capturing the moment. Madison, graceful as ever, stepped away from the podium, crouching down to meet Chloe's eyes. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "you and I talk about big things at home." Chloe, As the evening wore on, Madison put on the mask of a CEO, smiling for photos with prominent donors, shaking hands and thanking those who had contributed. Yet, despite the polished exterior, her mind kept returning to Chloe's words. The room felt more like a stage, and Madison found herself retreating from it, stepping toward the balcony to find a moment of quiet. The city stretched out beneath her, glittering like a jewelry box, every light reflecting her own unease. Chloe appeared beside her, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Madison shook her head, her hand brushing through Chloe's hair. "No, sweetheart, I'm proud of you. But sometimes the truth feels like it's coming from a place I wasn't ready to hear." Chloe leaned into her mother's side, her head resting against Madison's shoulder. "I didn't mean to interrupt everything," she said, her voice so honest it made Madison's chest tighten. "I know, but it was a question that needed to be asked, and sometimes the truth only comes out when we're brave enough to say it." Madison draped her shawl around Chloe's shoulders, wrapping them both in the quiet comfort of their shared moment. Chloe looked up at her mother again, a softness in her eyes. "I miss him less when I think about what could be next." Madison swallowed, the lump in her throat growing. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." They stood there together for a long moment, the sounds of the event still drifting from the ballroom behind them, The press, the donors, the cameras, it all seemed like a world apart. And yet, here they were, mother and daughter, still piecing together the future. After a while, the sound of the MC's voice filtered through the balcony door. "Press is organizing downstairs," he said gently. "We can decline, but they're running with whatever angle they've already decided on." Madison turned to Chloe, her face resolute. "One rule," she said. "No one gets to know anything about you that you don't want them to know. This is our story, not their buffet." Chloe nodded, squaring her shoulders like a little warrior. "Got it." As they walked back into the room, the cameras were waiting, flashing relentlessly. Questions came from every angle. "Ms. Hale, are you launching a dating show?" one reporter asked, his voice eager for scandal. Another voice broke through. "Is this healthy for a child?" Madison raised her hand for silence, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I'm not hosting auditions for my life," she said, her gaze unwavering. "What I'm doing is giving my daughter a voice in the process. Children deserve to have a say in the shape of their lives." At the back of the room, a reporter raised an eyebrow. "Criteria, Ms. Hale, what should men know?" Madison smiled. "Kindness is non-negotiable," she said, her eyes flicking briefly to Chloe. "Integrity under pressure, humor that isn't a weapon, and a willingness to eat ice cream in winter." A few laughs rippled through the room, but one question stood out. "Would you date below your tax bracket?" came the sharp inquiry. Madison's smile tightened. "What I won't date is arrogance," she replied coolly. "And for the record, ice cream in winter is a must." As the questions subsided and the event continued, Madison found herself thinking about Chloe's question again, about what it meant to truly choose someone, not just for what they could offer, but for who they were at their core. The future wasn't just about business deals or money. It was about family, connection, and choosing the right people to stand beside you when the world watched and when it didn't. The gala had ended, but Madison still felt the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. The next few weeks were filled with the usual rush of work, meetings, calls, emails, but in the background, the thought of finding someone for their family kept tugging at her. Chloe's words had changed something in Madison, something deep and unspoken. There was a quiet clarity now in her life, but also an uncertainty about what came next. The day after the event, at home, the penthouse smelled of fresh lemon and paper, a scent that usually calmed Madison. She had 2 calendars in front of her, one for quarterly closings and one for Chloe's piano recital and orthodontist appointments. She poured a cup of tea, but instead of diving into work, she opened her laptop and started drafting a note to herself. 4-week plan, she typed. Low-key meetings, daytime public spaces, no press, background checks. Yes, Chloe's input recorded privately. Therapy check-ins bi-weekly. Ordinary moments over staged ones. The list was simple, but it was a shift toward a life where Chloe had a voice, where Madison wasn't just building a company, but building a life that could truly hold space for love, family, and honesty. Just then, Chloe floated into the room, wearing pajamas decorated with watercolor moons. "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" she asked casually, curling into the chair beside Madison. "Of course," Madison replied, smiling, "but you know you'll still end up in your own bed." Chloe grinned, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Yeah, but I'll start there." As the night wore on, the routine continued. Dinner, a little reading, and then a quiet moment in Madison's office where she turned off her laptop and focused on what really mattered. She couldn't help but smile as she glanced at Chloe, who was already sketching ideas for their upcoming meetings. "I want to make a list," Chloe said, her voice full of determination. "Not just names, but the qualities that matter." Madison sat back, proud of how her daughter had grown in such a short time. "What are those qualities?" Chloe's eyes shone as she looked up. "Kindness, humor that's fun, someone who listens, and can eat ice cream in winter." Madison chuckled. "Sounds like a good list." Together they mapped out the qualities that mattered most to them, creating a checklist of sorts for the kind of person they would invite into their lives. Chloe's focus was as sharp as ever, and Madison couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just about finding a man. It was about finding someone who could understand their world, respect their values, and love them both in the way they deserved. The next few days were a blur of ordinary moments: coffee with one man, a walk through a museum with another, and a lunch at a hotel lobby with yet another. Chloe, always honest and unafraid, rated them all on their ice cream choices, their conversations, and their genuine interest in her. Each man had qualities she admired, but none felt right. They were polite, competent, even kind, but none of them clicked with the rhythm of their lives. As they met, Chloe asked her usual question: "Do they eat ice cream in winter?" It was a small question, but it held a deeper truth. It wasn't about the ice cream. It was about how someone could embrace life's simple pleasures, how they could meet them in the quiet moments, without the glitz or the pressure of the world around them. Chloe's voice was unwavering. "It's the small things that matter," she said one evening as they headed home from a museum tour, "like how they treat people who can't help them, and whether they'll eat ice cream in the winter." As the weeks passed, Madison found herself growing more comfortable with the process, despite the occasional unease. The men they had met were decent, but none seemed to truly fit into the life Madison and Chloe had built. It wasn't that any of them were bad. They were all in their own ways kind, successful, and generous, but none had that spark, that quiet strength that Madison realized she was looking for. One crisp afternoon, Madison and Chloe were visiting a construction site where one of the men, Luis, was leading a tour. He was an architect with a passion for building homes that didn't just stand tall, but made people feel safe inside them. As they walked the site, Chloe's small voice cut through the usual chatter. "Why are pigeons always invited to construction?" she asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Luis, unfazed, smiled, "Because they never sign NDAs." Chloe giggled, and Madison felt a small sense of relief. Luis didn't perform, he included. He was calm, thoughtful, and kind in a way that made everyone feel comfortable. But even as they walked the site, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing. The moments were ordinary yet important, but she still hadn't found the man who could truly stand beside her and Chloe in their world. It wasn't until a few days later that Madison's perspective shifted. The elevator at the construction site broke down, trapping Madison, Chloe, and Luis inside. The small space felt tighter with every passing second, the air thickening. Chloe gripped Madison's sleeve, her breath shallow with anxiety. "It's okay," Madison said, trying to keep her voice light. "We're okay." Luis, ever the professional, immediately pressed the emergency call, but as the minutes dragged on, it was clear they were stuck, and the tension in the elevator rose. That was when Daniel appeared. "Hey there," came a calm voice from outside. "I'm Daniel. I'm here with maintenance. You're safe." Madison had barely registered his name before the elevator car lurched, and the door opened just enough for Daniel's face to emerge. There was something in the way he stood there, unflustered, that made Madison feel a deep sense of relief. He spoke with a calmness that immediately put Chloe at ease. "Can you help me practice?" Daniel asked Chloe, guiding her through deep breaths to calm her anxiety. "This box is a liar. It tells your brain the sky is gone, but the sky didn't leave. Your brain just forgot where the door is." Chloe's grip on Madison's arm loosened, and together they followed Daniel's instructions. They breathed together, naming things they could touch, hear, and feel. Daniel's quiet assurance was the anchor they needed in the midst of the storm. When the door finally opened and they were free, Chloe looked up at Daniel, eyes wide with gratitude. "You used a nice voice," she said. Daniel chuckled. "I saved the mean one for broken vacuum cleaners." Madison watched them exchange that moment of quiet understanding, and something shifted inside her. It wasn't the grand gestures, the polished appearances, or even the accolades that made someone truly remarkable. It was the steady, unshakable presence, the kind of strength that didn't ask for recognition, but simply did what was needed. Later, as they stood outside the building, Chloe slipped her hand into Daniel's, a simple gesture, but one that carried so much meaning. Madison watched them, her heart tight in her chest. The moment was small, but it was everything. In the days that followed, Madison found herself thinking more and more about Daniel. It wasn't just the way he had saved them from the elevator. It was the quiet integrity he carried with him, the steadiness in his presence that felt like home. And when Chloe asked, "Is he on the list?" Madison knew that the real question was no longer about the men they were meeting. It was about the man who had already proven, without words, that he belonged in their lives. Madison could no longer ignore the pull she felt toward Daniel. He wasn't just someone who could help her with a project or step in during a crisis. He was someone who quietly understood the rhythm of her life, the unsung moments that made it meaningful. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration. Instead, it was the small, consistent acts of kindness and strength that had made her feel safer, more understood. He was the man who had earned his place in their world, not through power or wealth, but through integrity and grace. One evening, after a particularly challenging day at the office, Madison found herself sitting on the balcony again, gazing out at the city. The same city that had watched her rise but now seemed to hum with a different kind of energy, one that felt less like ambition and more like possibility. Chloe joined her, her small form squeezing beside her mother. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Chloe asked softly. Madison nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I do. Because we're not just choosing someone who fits into our world. We're choosing someone who makes it better." The door behind them opened, and Daniel stepped out, his presence calm and steady. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, letting the silence settle between them. There was a question in his eyes, a quiet uncertainty. "Is everything okay?" Chloe, as usual, didn't hesitate. "Mom chose you," she said simply, her voice clear and honest. Daniel froze, his expression unreadable. It was the first time anyone had said it out loud in front of him. The weight of the decision, of the choice, hung in the air. Madison met his gaze, her heart pounding. She had known deep down that this was the right path. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be whispers, challenges, and more than a few people who questioned her judgment. But in Daniel she had found something far more precious than status or security. She had found someone who was steady, someone who cared not just for her, but for Chloe, someone who could share in their life without trying to take over it. "I chose you," Madison said finally, her voice quiet but certain. "Because you make our world better. You see what matters, and you understand how to love without conditions. And that's all I've ever wanted." Daniel's expression softened, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He stepped closer, and without saying another word, he pulled them both into a quiet embrace. Three people, finding their place in a world that hadn't always been kind or easy, but had now started to make sense in ways it never had before. As they stood together, with the city stretching out before them, Madison realized something she had only begun to understand. Family wasn't about titles or wealth or status. It was about love, respect, and the willingness to choose each other over and over again. In that moment, she knew that whatever came next, whatever battles, whatever challenges, they would face it together. Chloe's voice broke through the quiet. "I'm glad you picked him, Mom." Madison smiled and pressed a kiss to Chloe's forehead. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." As they stood there, hand in hand, Madison thought about the road that had led her here. It hadn't been a straight line, but it had been hers, and now it was theirs to walk together. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain, was now full of possibilities. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family built on love, honesty, and the quiet decisions that made all the difference. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what part of this story touched your heart the most? Your thoughts and experiences matter, and I'd love to read them in the comments below. If this story moved you, inspired you, or simply made you believe in love a little more, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next journey we share together. Thank you truly for spending this time with me today. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love and in the beauty of the family you choose.